Hi, and welcome to Learning Objective 7 in Chapter 25. In this particular learning objective, we're going to take a look at how investments in education and research and development impact economic growth and productivity. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, so here we are, Learning Objective 7. And when we talk about these two um, investments, meaning investment in education, one of the things is that it is more longer term. So I'm going to go ahead and write that up here. It's longer term, and sometimes it's difficult to see. You're not going to see the return on the investment in terms of tax dollars being used for education until sometime in the future. And this is why often we see educational cuts are easy because you don't really see a short-term downfall to it, but you do see it in the longer term. So again, this is the investment in human capital, which we have called H in the Cobb-Douglas production function. And it does help to close the gap. Education is one of those things that really do help poorer countries um, catch up when we talked about the catch-up effect. The opportunity cost is exactly what you're probably encountering is foregone wages. So do you attend school or do you take the job immediately? So when we talk about that, that is often our trade-off that we are making in terms of investing in education. It's often difficult in poorer countries to make the case that education pays off for the family because many times, especially if the country does not have child labor laws, that child can go out and help sustain um, or work in on the farm, work in various industries, and may make a very small wage, let's say $2 US dollars in a foreign country. Whereas if they invest in school, they're not going to be making anything in the short term, but in the long term, we're going to see a lot higher wages and perhaps a job that provides some leisure time and some other things. There are a lot of positive externalities, and remember, an externality are those things that we do not see by the market participant. So, for instance, if we talk about college educated citizens, in college educated citizens, we often make there is a positive correlation between higher citizenship. Um, those people will end up with higher paying jobs and eventually pay higher taxes. Okay, so that's some of the things that we say there's positive externalities, meaning society is affected positively by people being educated. One of the problems for poor countries is a brain drain. And this is where, for example, if someone from a poor country comes to the US to study, they might stay in the US because they get a higher wage. Okay, so knowledge is what we call a public good. And in a public good, what we mean is we can't prevent anyone from getting it. So it's non-excludable. And we also can provide one person education without taking away from someone else. So we call that in economics non-rival. So the two factors is non-excludable and non-rival. We talk about research and development. The government subsidizes a lot of research through the National Science Foundation and other types of things, the National Institutes of Health. And I kind of talked about that one in the intro for this particular video. Again, providing tax breaks, grants. Some of those grants don't have to be repaid and so on. Again, the idea is human capital, and it leads to a healthier overall population, okay? Healthier workers are more productive because they don't miss as much work, so missing time, and they may miss time only because of sickness, so they get sick pay. We noticed that during Corona, that was a big issue, with some people wanting to go to work because they wouldn't get sick pay, okay? All right. So health of the population, again, making the right investments, and that's really the key is what is the right investment, and it depends on the country. And there is some historical long-term growth that we've seen, economically speaking, for improved health from better nutrition, taller workers, believe it or not, there is a lot of research that says taller workers have higher wages, better productivity. Now we want to be careful because just because a wage is higher doesn't necessarily mean those workers are more productive. In the US, for example, there is no correlation between worker happiness and worker productivity. So we want to be careful about drawing those conclusions. Some studies have tried to do that, but a lot of them have been refuted. In poor countries, again, not healthy, so therefore, can they really perform to their greatest potential? And again, cannot afford healthcare and nutrition. So those are some of the big downpours that, or drawbacks that we see when we're talking about poorer countries, and not only the lack of infrastructure, but also the lack of basic sanitation and some of the things that we talked about in the second objective to chapter 25. Okay, so it's a virtuous circle, okay? Policies that lead to more rapid economic growth would promote future economic growth. So once you make the investment, that investment in that country is not going to pay off until the long term. But what happens is, in the long term, it continues to perpetuate itself into higher growth or higher GDP per person. Hi, and welcome to Chapter 25, our last learning objective 8. In this learning objective, we're going to talk a little bit about governments and government structure in terms of political stability, command versus capitalistic types of structures. And then we're going to take a look at a short video on forecasting past 2020 for economic growth in a global context. And then we'll take a look at 2 other short little videos that take a look at innovation and how to foster innovation and inclusion as part of economic growth. So let's go ahead and get to it. I'll share my screen with you. There we are. Okay, so again, we're going to take a look at how government structure and stability impact growth rates. So one of the things that we often know in economics is there is a trade-off between safety and rights. So we can give you all the rights that we want, but we do so at the safety. So as we increase the rights, the safety tends to go down, vice versa. You're seeing that right now with the Black Lives Movement. And so when we talk about property rights, in a capitalistic society, we have property rights. We have the right to enforce contracts through the Uniform Commercial Code, okay? And that allows us, again, the courts will enforce the property rights. If we don't have property rights, then we have a major problem. Again, we have fraud, corruption, for example, and this we might see in underdeveloped nations, or sometimes in command economies that not all of the industries are under the same command type of economy. What that means is there might be government ownership of the factors of production of land, labor, and capital. Notice this is some of the byproducts that we see from corruption. So here's an example. I love this. This is a bridge in Rio de Janeiro. And, you know, take a look at it. Kind of seems like it's useless, but this bridge is unnecessary as it doesn't shorten the road. The bridge cost $5 million US. The opening event for the bridge was $80,000. People who live in this area of Rio de Janeiro earn about $700 per month. And so, you know, why did the bridge exist? We might ask ourselves a lot of those types of questions, particularly when we're talking about political issues and some of those kinds of things, even in our country. So political instability, again, revolutions and coups, we tend to see a lot of that. We want to know how stable is the government, because if you have warring factions that continue to change over the government entity, what can happen is private companies can be taken over by the government. And again, there's no incentive for us to invest in those types of nations, because the threat of that occurring becomes really quite palatable and very difficult for us to maintain. There are two types of policies in terms of trade. There are inward-oriented policies, and this is basically what we've been pursuing from an administration standpoint here in the U.S. Most economists do not agree with inward orientees. This is where you're going to see tariffs, you're going to see quotas, and you're going to see a lot of trade tit for tat. So kind of difficult to maintain economic growth. Again, this is what economists tend to say. It has an adverse effect, on economic growth. Outward-oriented policies would be things like NAFTA. That was a good example of an outward-oriented policy. Also, the European Union being part of that. And again, we've seen some countries as of late, for example, Great Britain leaving the European Union. So it does help integrate the world economy. We do know from an economic standpoint, it does lead to economic growth. Another factor that influences economic growth is the amount of population. Because all resources are scarce, the greater the population, then what we have are those resources have to be spread over more people. And that usually means that we're going to have a degradation of the types of resources. So a lot more consumers. Again, economists will say that stretches our natural resources. If we continue on our current ever-increasing population rate, then what we're going to have is some difficulty providing for that population. So many times you will see administrations and political issues centered around population growth. China's one-child policy is an example of that, although now it's 2 children. But again, why did they do that? It seems very foreign to us in this country, but limiting the number of children likewise means limiting the population. Some other examples, diluting capital stock. And again, when we talk about capital stock, machinery, those kinds of things, and then we get lower productivity per worker and a lower GDP per worker. So some of the ways to reduce the rate of growth, again, here we go. And equal opportunity, equal opportunities become pretty important to provide some alternatives to the traditional role of what women were in society. Again, promoting technological progress. If we have more people, then we have more scientists, more innovation. And so those are some of the positive externalities that should come from population growth. So here's a question, really. Why is so much of Africa poor? And if we look at the sub-Saharan Africa, and these are some statistics that your author had polled, poverty among smallholders in Africa would be 16 percentage points higher without the income from their natural resources. So here we can kind of take a look at some examples comparing sub-Saharan Africa to Latin America, South Asia, and East Asia. There is a lot of low capital investment. So for example, not a lot of people are, foreign direct investment is very low. And when we talk about foreign portfolio investment, again, kind of low. And these are some of the reasons why we're seeing this, particularly rampant corruption and the restriction of freedom. Okay, that's the end of my part for this. And then we're going to go on into, I think, 3 videos total. And I look forward to seeing you in chapter 26. Thanks.
The global economy is expected to grow by 3% annually over the next half-century. But growth will be much stronger and much faster in emerging economies than in the developed countries of the OECD. The United States is the world's biggest economy today, representing 23% of global economic activity. GDP will shrink to 18% by 2030 and just 17% in 2060. China, which produces about 17% of global GDP today, is expected to pass the US to become the world's biggest economy. It will produce 28% of global GDP in 2030 and should stay at that level through 2060. China's growth and that of other fast-developing emerging countries will be driven by a better educated and more productive workforce. India will also benefit from population growth. It will jump from 7% of global GDP today to 11% in 2030 and 18% in 2060. Population aging, on the other hand, will drag down growth in many countries and regions. The euro area is the world's second leading economy, with 17% of global GDP. As the number of active Europeans declines, Europe's share of the world economy will drop to 12% by 2030 and just 9% by 2060. Japan, which accounts for 7% of global GDP today, faces a similar crisis. Its aging population will push its share of global GDP down to 4% by 2030 and just 3% by 2060. Today, the 34-country OECD represents 65% of global GDP. This will drop to just 43% in 2060, smaller than China and India, and well below the combined GDP of emerging economies. Incomes and living standards in emerging economies will converge with those in the OECD. Today, per capita GDP in countries like China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey is just a fraction of that in the United States. After 50 years of rapid growth and shifting wealth, the emerging countries have drastically reduced the income gap with the United States. Richer OECD countries like France, Italy, Spain, Ireland, Greece will see their per capita income fall when compared with the US. None of these OECD projections are set in stone. Improving public finances and implementing bold structural reforms can boost long-term growth and living standards in advanced and emerging economies alike.